Genesis chapter 18. So there are 50 chapters in Genesis. We're starting chapter 18. Anyone care to guess what message number this is in Genesis, besides Sherrod? No, thankfully not that many. This is, Jared and I are on a different count. There was one message I gave that was on pride that kind of it was topical off of something I did in Genesis, and he counted in the series. So my notes are different than the YouTube labels, but this is my number 95 message on Genesis. That's crazy. Thankfully, the chapters speed up in terms of what's here. We spent a lot of time doing preliminary stuff, if you remember, so that we could tackle Genesis on its own terms when it came to it. So, anyway, this chapter raises its own issues, which I'm not sure if we're going to deal with or not. They had the angel of the Lord, things like that are particularly mysterious in this text, and we could spend a number of weeks trying to just handle that topic, but I don't plan on doing that at this time. So, well, we're still waiting on. It's all my family that's gone. So. I'll beg your pardon. Does anyone have a question from Genesis 18 they're dying to have answered? Besides who the angel of the Lord is? Speak now.
We had a fun time in Six Flags.
You did? Good. Good. That's a fun place. No one has any questions of Genesis 18. Well, I can just sit down then. There's no, I suppose the point of me teaching isn't just to answer questions, right? It's to confront us with what God is saying. All right, so Genesis chapter 18. I'm titling this message, God's First Visit to Abraham and Sarah. And what I mean by that is twofold. First of all, this is God's first visit to Sarah really at all. He hasn't really addressed her. She's just been along for the ride. God's dealt exclusively with Abraham until now. It's the first time God speaks to Sarah. And even then, the only thing he technically says to Sarah is, "No, but you did laugh." That's it. Everything else is to Abraham, and she's eavesdropping, and then he sort of rebukes Sarah through Abraham. He doesn't even speak to Sarah in that sense at first. So, but it's definitely the first time she's included on this. I mean, until now, she's heard reports from her husband about what this God has said. That's kind of staggering in a way. We can be thankful as believers that's in Christ that there's no distinction, male and female, right? I mean, how different it would be for the men, but particularly for the women, if God just dealt with you exclusively through what He told your husband. So that's one thing that I mean by this, God's first visit to Abraham and Sarah. The other thing I mean is it's the first time that He's visited them since they've been called Abraham and Sarah. So that's never happened before. And so we find it's in that sense it's the first first visit to Abraham and to Sarah. And anyway, so this is where we are. We've turned a corner in the story. God has shown up in Genesis chapter 17 and promised the birth of a son to Abraham through Sarah. And anybody remember what was Abraham's response to that news? What was Abraham's first response when God said, you're going to have a son through Sarah? What did Abraham say? Or what did he do? Anyone? Okay, so that was the second thing that he said. So that's the thing he said to God. The first thing he said to himself. Remember? Right, he's too old, right? What's he say? Look in verse 17. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? So Abraham's response was disbelief, almost incredulity, like surely this wouldn't happen, and this can't be right. She's that old. We don't know how old Hagar was, but she sure wasn't as old as Sarah, and it just didn't seem appropriate, didn't seem fitting, and he kind of rejected it. And that what he was realizing kind of settled in on him, that meant nothing for Ishmael, and so he rejected God's idea. He didn't want it. And God, of course, wasn't for negotiating and insisted that it would be this way, and even named the son, named him, right? After Abraham had laughed, then God says, verse 19, and God said, no, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son. You shall call his name Isaac, right? Which means he laughs. So it's like he was going to name him. So Isaac is, if you think about this, Isaac is not named after Sarah's laughter, but Abraham's. Right? Sarah laughed later, but nothing was said about his name then. The only time before his birth that his name is mentioned is immediately after Abraham laughs. So his memorial is not necessarily to Sarah's laughter, but to Abraham's laughter, to his father's laughter. So there's that. Now, there was this covenant of circumcision that was made, through which the people of God would begin to be marked out in the world, right? And Abraham followed through. It says immediately, verse 22, when God had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son and all those born in his house or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God had said to him. Right? Verse 26, that very day Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised, and all the men of his house, those born in the house and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. And so you have this wonderful response from Abraham in terms of the timeliness of it, the willingness of it, the resolve that he demonstrated. Everybody that very day, all the men were circumcised. And there'd be a lot of reasons to put it off, to have a meeting and discuss and convince the men this was going to be something they were going to do, but Abraham did it that very day. It doesn't appear that he even told Sarah about it, about why he was doing it and those kinds of things. And that's kind of neither here nor there in terms of whether he should have told her, but it's just not there. But it's wonderful to see his immediate response, his willingness. At first he said no, he rejected God's plan and God's design. What God was telling him was going to happen, he didn't want it. He wanted Ishmael instead, right? He already had this son for the last 13 years. He'd assumed Ishmael was the child of promise, and now imagine 13 years of pouring into this kid, and now it just seems like it's wasted, On the other sense, think of the blessing. For, those of us who are parents, think about just maybe who your oldest is and think, the things you wish you would have done a little bit different now. Well, he's 13 years old, and Abraham gets to start over with a new child of promise. And so maybe in that sense, it's a good thing. Some things he would have done differently. I don't know. But nonetheless, there's 13 years of loving this boy, and now we find Abraham arguing with God and pleading for the blessings to come upon this boy Ishmael. And God refuses him and insists that he's going to go forward with this other plan, this something that God's had in mind all along, but Abraham has not known about. God could have told Abraham about it, but he chose not to. And so this is what Abraham's been doing and believing for these 13 years, and now he finds out that's wrong, and God's going to do something else instead. He didn't like it, but God wouldn't budge, and then Abraham decided he would follow the Lord in this. He wanted the blessings of God. He wanted what God had promised. He wanted God himself, and so he went through with this covenant of circumcision. Now, it brings us then to Genesis chapter 18. You remember at the end of 17, the Lord spoke to him, and then the Lord, as soon as he got done speaking, he left. And the next thing we read in verse 18, and the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre. So then suddenly the Lord returns again. And this time, it's not with a 13-year gap, but, maybe the next day. We don't even know. It doesn't say exactly. Probably maybe a couple weeks' time, maybe it's gone by, and here he is. But we begin in chapter 18. So what I'd like to do is to pray, ask for the Lord's help in making this text alive to us and real and impactful for us. Then we'll read all of Genesis chapter 18, but today our focus will be on the first 15 verses. So that's where we'll be. So let's pray. Father in heaven, we gather together again to sit under your word, to hear from you, to have our thoughts about you challenged, and to see you more as you ought, to be fixed upon the living God and encouraged and inspired to serve him and to love him. Corrected and rebuked where necessary. We pray, Lord, that you'd take this word and minister to us with it. We think of Paul's words there that we need to renew our minds in your word, to be transformed. And so we're praying along that end, Lord. Help us today. Amen. Genesis chapter 18 and verse 1. And the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the earth, and said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves. And after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So they said, Do as you have said. And Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it, and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd, and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man, who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared, and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, Where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, She's in the tent. The Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old and advanced in years, and the way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? And the Lord said to Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. He said, No, but you did laugh. Then the men set out from there, and they looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way. And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. Then the Lord said, Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know. So the men turned from there and went toward Sodom. But Abraham still stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And the Lord said, If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Abraham answered and said, Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And he said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. Again he spoke to him and said, Suppose 40 are found there. And he answered, For the sake of 40 I will not do it. Then he said, Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there. He answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. He said, Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. He answered, For the sake of 20 I will not destroy it. Then he said, Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. He answered, For the sake of 10 I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham. And Abraham returned to his place. All right. Quite the chapter here. There's a couple very different kinds of things that are happening here. I would venture to say you could divide this chapter up, I think, in terms of 2 purposes for God's visit to Abraham. 2 separate and distinct purposes for God's visit to Abraham. Those 2 purposes, the first one, I believe, is to specify the birth of Isaac and to make this clear to Sarah, and in doing so, to build the faith both of Abraham and Sarah, to specify the birth of Isaac. It's one thing for God to say, one day you're going to have a son, you and Sarah are going to have a son, this is what his name's going to be when he comes. It's another thing to say, look at your calendar, we'll give you a date. It's going to be right about this time. So within a couple weeks maybe of this time next year, you can mark it down. I'm going to come again and you'll see Sarah's got a son. That is quite distinct from just saying one of these days this will happen, right? And so it specifies the birth of Isaac. And also to make this clear to Sarah. Again, as I said, he's not spoken to Sarah yet about any of this specifically, and it doesn't appear that she's even heard about it. It's new news to Abraham too. I mean, he hasn't known about this for very long. And Sarah doesn't appear to have found out about it. We can't say that dogmatically, but she sure acts surprised when she hears about it in the tent. So either she heard about it before and just was like, no way, you heard wrong. Sorry, Abraham, you're crazy. why you did that to Ishmael and why you're doing these things. This can't be right. And then later she believes, or she's laughing. I find that hard to believe. I think she probably didn't know anything about it at all. And then the second purpose is to teach Abraham more about the righteous character of God through this upcoming judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? This was what was to take place. And so we find God interacting with Abraham and with Sarah on those points to make clear to Sarah about what's going to come to pass and to specify the birth of Isaac so that he might build their faith. And then secondly, to teach Abraham more about the character of God and his righteous nature as a judge when it comes to Sodom. Now I say two purposes, and maybe there are more, but I'm saying two, and I'm not saying three. The third purpose, you might say, in terms of the Lord's coming to, or visiting here, is, we'll just think about it this way. Imagine the story. Here's Abraham. He looks out. He sees three men coming on this journey. He runs out, interrupts their journey, comes to them. He invites them to his home. He feeds them. Then he sends them on their way. Two of the men continue. One lingers on and kind of invites Abraham to ask some questions. And Abraham begins to, and kind of goes through a real crisis in terms of he's beginning to think about what's going to take place. And he's got questions that really need to get answered, and he's not sure what the Lord might do, and he asks the question, and then it's still an issue, and he asks again and again and again, and he goes through this until it's kind of resolved for him. And then we find in chapter 19, verse 1, the two angels come to Sodom in the evening. The Lord never made it to Sodom. So God's purpose in coming wasn't to go to Sodom to check it out. That's what the angels were for. God's purpose was just to come and talk to Abraham and Sarah and have these discussions. So you don't say the third purpose of the Lord's visit was to go inspect Sodom. Like that was what the angels were for. God was just going to go so far as Abraham and then disappear, and so just 2 points. So the only reason the Lord specifically is here and appearing in any way is to have these conversations with Abraham and to make these things known to Sarah. And so it's kind of helpful in a way. It's not as though Abraham just interrupted the Lord from doing what the Lord was doing. God came specifically to deal with them and to help them, to teach them, to encourage them, to build them up. And so we're just looking at two purposes then, not a third. That's a danger in saying that and saying there were only two purposes, because God is always doing more than we realize, right? I mean, there are other things happening kind of under the text in their hearts and lives that are going on here. How does this young man who killed this goat, what does he walk away from the day thinking? I mean, what is going on? There's all kinds of things that are going on in these situations. But the two main things we're talking about are these purposes with Abraham and with Sarah. So today we're just going to consider again the first half of the chapter, verses 1 to 15, and the first purpose of the Lord's visit, to specify the birth of Isaac and make this clear to Sarah and to build the faith of Abraham and Sarah both. As we begin, as we look through here, I'm going to bring up some details and talk about things my main reason for bringing them up is just to help us understand the passage more and all of what's going on. The main thrust of what I'm trying to do really won't come till a little bit more towards the end. So just kind of bear with me as we work our way through the text. The first thing we have in verse 18, and the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. Now what we have here is the narrator telling us what's happening. This is not Abraham telling us what happened. He didn't say, I looked up and saw the Lord. Because it says, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, three men were standing in front of him. So it's as though before the curtain rises, right, the narrator has come out and he said, now what happened, what you're about to hear about and read about is that the Lord appeared to Abraham by these oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door to his tent in the heat of the day. And he steps off, the curtain rises, and you begin to watch, and you begin to see. And here's Abraham, and he's out in front of, well, that must be his tent, because this guy just told you it was in front of his tent. And there's these shade trees there, and he's there sitting in the shade. And you're not sure how hot it is, but he told you it was the heat of the day, so you know immediately it's hot out here. And then Abraham, startled, looks, and he sees these men, wherever they are, some ways away, but they're standing in front of him. And when he saw them, he ran from his tent door to meet them. Right? So this is kind of how this starts. And so the narrator just begins to tell us what Abraham doesn't yet know, that it is the Lord who is come to meet him. Now, Abraham just thinks it's 3 men. Now, this happens by the oaks of Mamre. You remember, this is kind of a peculiar name, the oaks of Mamre, in that if you think of the oaks of Mamre as like this specific place where you could go, you're not entirely wrong, but Mamre is not a city and a place, it's a man. Mamre was one of the men. If you look at Genesis chapter 14, verse 13, then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite. Mamre the Amorite. Mamre was one of the 3 men, Mamre and his 2 brothers, Eshcol and Aner, who went and helped Abraham rescue Lot. Look at Genesis chapter 14 and verse 24. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner and Eshcol and Mamre take their share. So this is where he's at. He's still, 13 years later or more years later, he's over here living at the oaks of Mamre. Now, he's not living with him. He's living, Mamre's got a place where he lives, a plot of land, and there's these oaks that he owns, right? Part of his land. And Abraham is not there in the city with them. He's out there in the outskirts. Mamre said, that's fine. If you don't want to live in the town or whatever, that's fine. You can live out there, out by those oaks out there. You can kind of set up there. And so he's there, living in his tent out there. That's where Abraham is. And he sits at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. Now, I guess I would ask, if it's really hot out, why not go in the tent? Why not go right at the door of the tent? It seems like an odd thing. I think the idea here is Abraham is generally out, maybe not doing all the servant work, but out in the midst of the servants doing his thing. And why does he come back to get at least to the tent, in front of his tent, under the shade trees of the oaks? Because it's the heat of the day, and that's the time where you want to take your rest and recoup. And so inside the tent would be where all the food and different things are generally prepared and made and cooked and that kind of stuff inside the tents. And then he'd go out, and maybe you're dirty from the day's work or whatever it is, and you eat outside. But he's eating under the shade trees because it's why? The heat of the day, right? He's kind of taking his rest and then get back at it. So this is kind of what life looks like, right? You go out, and you're tending to your flocks and your herds. When it gets hot out, you seek shade. And he's out here seeking shade. He's there at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. So he lifts up his eyes and looks, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after you may pass on, since you've come to your servant. Now, there's something called like Eastern or ancient hospitality, you might think of, and this is a good example of it. Kind of custom, right? Someone comes by needing food or shelter, you do what you can to go be hospitable to them and help them. You might think Abraham has a servant who he later sends out to his hometown out there, out in Haran, out in that area, to go find a wife for Isaac. And what did that servant say? Remember, he gets to that well, and he's thinking, he's feeling the weight of what Abraham has sent him to do. I've got to go and I'm going to bring back someone who's going to be Isaac's wife. The pressure's on. I don't want to just choose whoever. And praise the Lord, let it be this woman who comes and she offers to take care of all the animals and to water all of them and take care of me, and I'll know then I've got a godly woman. I've got a woman of character. And sure enough, this woman comes and does more than he even thought. And she's the one. There's Rebecca. And we tend to think of hospitality in a lesser light. We think, well, if you're not that hospitable, it's your own home, privacy of your home. Your neighbors don't have any right to your stuff, and let people fend for themselves and this kind of thing. But that's really not the way. All the way through, the Bible exhorts us, even as a particular Christian virtue, hospitality, even as a spiritual gift, the gift of hospitality. It's quite a thing. Caring for others in their need. Entertaining angels unaware. Surely they were talking about Abraham, at least, in that instance. So hospitality is a big deal. And we don't seem to practice it too much anymore. But it's such a big deal, so high on the list of virtues for God that you might think, if I were to ask you, maybe you already know the answer to this, and surely I'm giving it away, showing my cards, but later on in Scripture, we have this term in our culture, sodomy and sodomites, and we refer to a certain kind of deviant sexual act when we talk about that. But in Scripture, when it talks about the sin of Sodom, what is the sin mentioned? Their lack of hospitality is what is said. Now, we read in Genesis 19, and we understand that it was a severe lack of hospitality. It was unbelievable, the abuse they meant to heap upon those men. But lack of hospitality. And the extreme contrast that we see between Abraham's hospitality to these men and the Sodomites' hospitality towards these men, it's stark. But not only is it stark because of these two polar opposite examples, but even among just kind of good people, you might say, in ancient times, what Abraham does is lavish and way over the top. And I'm going to show you some things to prove that to you. You might read this and, we go to other countries sometimes and we're amazed at their hospitality and we think, well, it's just their culture, they do these things. If you're the visitor, they provide the best food for you and that kind of stuff. And that exists, and that existed even then. But not the way Abraham did it. This is crazy. And I just want to show you that. So I want to, my point in doing this is to demonstrate something of what this text shows, what a good faith effort Abraham made at the beginning to do what God called him to do. You remember in Genesis 17? I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly. God was calling him to have an awareness of God and God's purposes for his life continually in his mind, and also then, in light of that, to live in a way that's blameless. And God had called Abraham to take all that God had given him and be a blessing to those that he runs across, that he sees, that he meets, everybody he encounters. And so here the next time, the Lord shows up. It's like, as a stranger, how's he going to do? Abraham sees him and runs. He takes off running. He doesn't say, well, maybe they're just going to pass by. Maybe they're not seeking assistance from me, so there's nothing necessary. I don't want to bother them. He takes off running, right? He lifted up his eyes, which doesn't, it's not like he had his head down and just looked up and you were standing right there. He looks up. There's some guys, and he just takes off running to go get them, right? It's really remarkable. He saw them. He ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth, right? Which was a great sign of respect, and says, right, bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Right? We know other texts in Scripture and other places in this culture where they would talk that way, to a stranger. Oh Lord, and it's just kind of saying, sir, please, would you come? If I've found favor in your sight, if you're willing to come, if I've pleased you in any way, if you'd be willing to come to bless me with your presence. And it's kind of just a very, a very kind way to talk. It's proper manners, proper etiquette, right? It's the best that you could do, the best kind of thing you could say. And so he says all these things. If I've found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. And he announces to them his plan. You know, this is what I'll do. We'll have a little water brought over, right? Water. Mark that down. If you're taking notes, this was the plan. A little water, right? Next, you could wash your feet. That sounds good. And then rest yourselves under the tree, right? While I bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves. And after that, you may pass on. A morsel of bread, a little piece. Here's a muffin for your travel, right? Something like this, like a little, get you some piece of bread. Now, in fairness, bread might not mean bread, right? Bread, that word sometimes refers to just sustenance, a meal. He might say, well, I'll give you something small to eat, you know, for your trip, some small amount of food. Bread was the most common. It traveled the best, generally, but this was the idea. And so this is what he says, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you've come to your servant. Which they didn't really come to him. They were just kind of over there, but he's like, well, now you've come, like, please. Like he's telling them he sees it. Just like in ancient times, if someone, even an enemy, were to come and seek refuge in your home, you were to protect them and provide for them. That was part of hospitality. You were to do that. Now, not everyone did this. Abraham stands out, just like today we'd say, what is culturally expected for someone to do in a certain situation? That isn't no guarantee that they're going to do it, right? Just because you can say, well, proper etiquette would be, that doesn't mean it gets done. I mean, proper etiquette existed in Egypt, and Abraham's saying, Sarah, you're going to have to lie to them because they're going to kill me, right? They're not going to treat us well. And he was right. And so this is the thing. Just because it's proper etiquette doesn't mean it's assumed or it's commonplace and always done. Not only to do what's proper and kind of tell them, look, I'm inviting you in here as someone who's come to my house. And so I see it, it's kind of a way to kind of get them to agree, right? Like for them to say, well, I know I've come to your house, but I'm not going to let you provide for us. It was almost like an insult to Abraham. For him to say all this and give his plan, what he wants to do for them, and say, since you've come to my house, you've come to me. They need to come. He's kind of imposing on them to accept. Nothing wrong with that, right? He means to bless them, and he's trying to get them to take advantage of what he's trying to offer them. And so they said, do as you have said. What did Abraham do? He went quickly. It's like he runs back. You know, they're coming. They're gonna come. They'll make their way over there. But he doesn't waste any time. He went quickly to the tent, into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour." Now, what did he talk to them about? This is funny because it's like Abraham, while he's running back, has got even bigger ideas of ways he can bless them and help them. Like, I'm going to do even more. So now 3 seahs of fine flour. Now, all you women, you know what a seah is, right? Because you use it all the time in your cooking. I would tell you, you don't even buy a seah of flour at a time, even at Sam's, right? So look here. Let's look if you have a note here. A seah was about 7 quarts, right? So that's not quite 2 gallons of fine flour per 1 seah. Now, imagine women being Sarah. Your husband comes running in, quick, 3 seahs of fine flour. So we're talking about 21 quarts. It says 7.3, so maybe 22 quarts, so 3.5 gallons of fine flour. Quick, knead it, make it, cook it, we got to go. Like, what are you talking, like, there goes my week, right? So I'd asked Angela, just because I'm not the one doing the cooking, and I rarely use flour when I do, when she makes for our whole family biscuits and gravy as a meal, right? How many cups 3 cups. So that's less than 1 quart, right? Feeds our whole family. And that's less than 1 quart. These guys got 21 quarts of the flour, right? That's incredible. We're talking about a massive amount of food. A little more than a morsel. And then what's worse, if you keep reading, we'll get to this in a minute, but he doesn't even serve it to the guys. They don't even eat it, which means it was for their journey. Like, it wasn't part of the meal he gave. He quickly prepared this meal, but the bread was going to take a little while. So that was after the meal, after their discussions. Then comes the bread, and it's just not mentioned anymore. But it was prepared for these guys for their journey. So that's even more staggering. So surely Sarah didn't do this by herself. They've got servants and things, but so she's in charge of making sure that this happens. That's a lot of, and it's the fine flour, not just flour. I mean, it's fine flour. It's the best stuff they got. And it's a lot of it. And it's just for the rest of their journey, which they're just going to Sodom. But he doesn't know yet where they're going. He has no idea. That hasn't been mentioned yet. Think of that. He's just sending them on their way. Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour. To give you an idea also, something of the size of this, when Elijah builds out that moat around his altar, remember, for the water to come be poured on, right? They build a moat even around there to hold the water. And they come, and how much water did they put on there? To soak it, 2 seahs. The moat held 2 seahs. So it's like, we're talking about a lot of flour. This is 3 seahs of flour. You could imagine she's thinking, we won't have anything left. You know, or he's wealthy, maybe they still will, but it's a lot more flour than the average person would have even had in their home. And this is what he, cook it up, knead it, and make cakes. And Abraham ran. Don't miss this. I mean, he went quickly, and he runs out to them. He goes quickly into the house. He tells Sarah, quick, this is what you got to do. And then he runs to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Everybody's understanding his urgency, right? But he's getting the best stuff. He took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Now, in terms of this calf, what I want to say about it, I just want to show you that often it wasn't, you would give this, for your guests, you would give them good food, but it wouldn't be a calf usually. Usually be like a young goat, not a young cow, not a calf. And so this was unique. And I want to turn to one text just to show you the significant difference here. In Luke chapter 15, story of the prodigal son, right? This parable the Lord tells. This is a really good text just to show you maybe how outlandish it was what Abraham was doing. Verse 28, the younger son, or the older son, you remember, is very frustrated and angry. Let's turn to verse 25. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he, or the servant, said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. You never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. You never even gave me a young goat. Right? Which would be, you're going to have some big celebration with people. It's like, you want to treat them well, kind of thing. You're going to have a wedding feast, maybe. What would you serve if you're having meat? Well, like a young goat. That's what you'd serve. Fine food. It's good. Better than what we usually eat. The young goat. You never even gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, he who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him. Right? I never even got a young goat. All these years I've been serving you, I never even got a young goat. He comes back, he squandered everything, and you give him the fatted calf. And he's furious. You see, it's not just, I never got a young goat, now he's getting a young goat. It's that I didn't even get this thing, which is a good thing, which I would have liked to have, but you're giving him the best, the very best. So here comes Abraham. These men come to him, and he runs to the herd and takes a calf, tender and good, right? Which is just, it's like the best. He looks out, and he's not looking for just give me a young one. He's looking, that's going to be the best one right there. And he grabs it. Tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. So the best that they had of the flour, and lots of it, the best meat that they have. Then he took curds and milk, right? So curds, which is the skimmed off fat of the milk, which most of us say, oh, that sounds gross. But if you like curds, then you like curds. And in that day and age, like any dairy product you like is made from the skimming off of the milk. So you can make some good things from the curds, right? And you make curds taste well and be delicious. He takes the curds and milk and the calf that he'd prepared and set it before them. And then what else happens? And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. He doesn't even eat with them. He doesn't eat with them. They enjoy this meal together while his servants serve them. He himself serves them. I mean, he didn't have a problem having servants involved. I mean, he told Sarah, you be in charge of making all these cakes. You, young man, slaughter that animal. And while he's getting all these things ready, then it's time to serve. He doesn't say, okay, you guys go ahead and serve them. He serves them himself. God called him to be this blessing. God called him to be this way, righteous in this way. You can't, this applies to our own life too, right? You can't, God calls you to do something, you can't farm it out to other people and, well, we pay them for that. I mean, how many churches do I know that they're like for evangelism? Well, we have a paid evangelist on staff, right? Or Christians who think, well, I'll just invite him to church and let the pastor evangelize him. Like, that's crazy. That's not how it works, right? God didn't tell Abraham to go see to it that his servants were a blessing. Abraham's supposed to be a blessing. He's got to be, this is his call. He needs to live righteously and blamelessly before God, not just pass it off for other people. So I say all of this and go through this partly because these are details we want to understand, but also because it really demonstrates for us, again, the good start that Abraham has made in terms of righteousness. He's doing well. He's excelling. He doesn't know anything about these guys. Until now, he just knows these are three guys walking through the wilderness. Verse 9, now it all changes. They said to him, where's Sarah, your wife? I mean, that's crazy. Isn't that remarkable? What would you say if someone you had never met, Scott, just said, so how's Carrie doing? Like, whoa, who are you again? How do you know my wife's name? Right? You'd want to know. And he said, surely kind of with a bewildered look on his face, she's in the tent. The Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. So, if you were Abraham and you were a man who had God appeared to you several times, and some stranger comes up and knows things he shouldn't know, you might kind of begin to think, wait, who is this? Well, she's in the tent. And then he says, well, I'm going to come back next year and Sarah's going to have a son. The only person who knows that is you and God. And so now you know who it is. He says, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. Now, it doesn't tell you what Abraham's response to this is. We're not told what Abraham said or how he replied. We just go, now we're in the tent and we're looking at Sarah. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. So she didn't go out there. Maybe she was afraid of the men. Maybe it's hard to say historically. It doesn't really look like it would have been improper for Sarah to have gone out and had the meal with these men. Maybe if Abraham was going to eat with them, she would have joined them. But since he's serving them, maybe it's not proper. There are some other reasons. If some of you are just really curious to know on this point, I can talk about some other reasons later, that some possible reasons why she was in the tent. But so now Abraham and Sarah so it says, and Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. So she's there. She's very curious. What has got her husband so eager? What is it about these men? And they don't have visitors like this all the time, so she's there listening in. Eavesdropping, right? Eavesdropping. It's one of my kids' favorite scenes from Lord of the Rings, where Samwise says, I'm not dropping no eaves. So there she is, right? Intruding on their conversation, but she's curious. She wants to know. And none of us really blame her. Now, before we read on any more about what Sarah, how she responds, the narrator wants to insert his own comments. Because we just read verse 10, and Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Verse 12, so Sarah laughed to herself, saying. But verse 11 is in between 10 and 12, and it's the narrator's comments. And he wants to lay some things out and don't let you forget about this so that you think rightly about what Sarah, how she responds. So she's listening to the door, at the tent door, and she just heard these things and says, now look, don't forget now, Abraham and Sarah are old. They are old. Wouldn't you love to have that in the Bible written about you? Now, this guy was old. But this is what it says. They are old. Advanced in years, right? They're advanced in what? If you want to be advanced in something, don't make it be years. Like, let it be something else. Advanced in years. And the way of women had ceased to be with Sarah, right? She's long past menopause. This is not going to happen. It had ceased to be with Sarah. So, because that's true, because that's the way things are, she laughed. And wouldn't you? You see, it's like it's the natural response. You'd say, what? And it's the same thing Abraham did. Only she doesn't object. Like Abraham said, no, Lord, this other thing. Let Ishmael live. It's not even as bad as what Abraham did. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with her. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, she's laughing to herself saying this, right? She's not shouting from the tent, after I'm worn out and my Lord is, she's not saying that. She's not saying, this guy's crazy. She's saying to herself, after I'm worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? Right? She doesn't want to get caught listening in. She's laughing to herself and about this inside the tent. It's not clear that Abraham heard her laugh. She's laughing inside the tent. And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Stop. Is that what she just said? I read, quote, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? God says, why did she say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? She's been misquoted. Like, well, no, she hasn't been. He's not exactly trying to quote her. But this is why she's laughing. She's thinking, as she says these to herself, this idea, after I'm worn out, my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? She's meaning, am I going to bear a child in my old age? Right? That's what she's talking about. And the Lord says, why did she laugh with this thought in her mind? With this is the idea. And here's the response. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Abraham may have, right before Sarah laughed, have figured out it was the Lord. But I'm not sure that Sarah knew. There's these guys, these visitors come. They have this meal. Abraham's all excited about, or worked up, at least eager to provide for them the best of things. And they have this conversation. They're out there talking. And among the things that get said, right away this guy asks, where is Sarah? And then he says, look, I'm going to come back next year and she's going to have a son. She laughs about it, and then next thing you know, the guy says, why did Sarah say this? Is anything too hard for God? And then it begins to dawn on her. At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. God's going to visit you again with a child. And then I think verse 15, but Sarah denied it, or says it, or acted falsely. And I think the idea is now it's like dawned on her who's here, and the idea that she may have offended them is huge, and she just wants to kind of cancel it out and cover it up, like, no, that's not what happened. My response wasn't, that'll never happen. Saying that because that could come across as offensive to the one who just said it would happen, right? So she wants to just not offend. She wants to just get this out of here, like, no, that didn't happen. Let's pretend that didn't happen. But God says, no, I'm sorry. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. I think she's afraid to offend. He said, no, but you did laugh. Then the men set out from there. That's like the end of the scene. So for Sarah, it's like lingering. The last thing that was said is, no, you did laugh. You did. What a thing. The Lord left it that way with her. No, you did laugh. Remember that. And he leaves. It's kind of staggering in a way. It's not how we want our last word of any conversation we have with anyone, or particularly with the Lord, to go. The last thing is, no, you just lied to me. You did, in fact, laugh when I told you what I was going to do. You didn't believe me. See you next year. It's like that's just left with that. But here it is for us. And then in verse 16, it continues on. Abraham goes with them to set them on their way. I'll stop there and just note that that's one more mark of Abraham's, just his righteousness here, is that he goes to set these men all on their way as well. And then to his surprise comes out what God is actually planning to do and why he's passing through. Now, so all of that, I think, highlights the good start that Abraham made, even by ancient standards. In terms of hospitality, it was wonderful. It was lavish. Very good. A tremendous example for us. But then we see this whole interaction with Sarah. And you see, I hope you see how it's quite, her laughter, even though she's kind of in disbelief at the same things that Abraham was, it's really different than Abraham's. Abraham turned and kind of said, no, God, I don't want that. Sarah laughed, was called out for it when she realized it was the Lord, just kind of lied about it, just kind of saying, no, you misheard, just not wanting to offend. God said, oh no, you did laugh. Remember that. Now, why does the Lord leave her with that? Why does the Lord not let that go and insist upon leaving her with this remembrance that she in fact had laughed when God had said this? Well, I think for the same reason he insisted to Abraham that the child's name be, he laughs. Not because Isaac was going to be a laughing kind of person. It had nothing to do with him, but it was everything to do with a lesson for Abraham and a lesson for Sarah. God came in Genesis 17 and spoke the things he did to Abraham about this son who was going to come, both to correct Abraham in the way that Abraham was wrongly grooming the wrong child, but also to encourage him. I mean, why not just give Sarah a child? Why announce beforehand that this is what he was going to do? Right? I mean, that's a big thing. So that they'd have their faith would be built. They'd say, God said this, and this is exactly what happened. He can be depended on. It doesn't have to look like it's going to happen. I can just trust him. Right? Here's Sarah analyzing the situation like anyone else would. She's old. They're both old. The way of women is past. And you laugh and say, I don't know who this guy is, but what he's saying, that's never going to happen. And she didn't know who he was. Just think about that for a second. If you were to go, who's the oldest woman you know? And if I were to tell you that, hey, did you hear that they're pregnant? You'd say, you heard wrong. Trust me, that didn't happen. There's no way. Right? I mean, you would know I was absolutely mistaken. That's not possible. And especially if she was married to a man who was even older, you'd say, And this is what she's doing. Some guy comes in and says this is going to happen. She says he's crazy, and she laughs. Well, this guy is funny. Could you imagine? After all these years, I'm worn out, ready for the grave. Just the other day, I was thinking to myself, how much longer could I possibly live? Right? And now I'm supposed to have a child? This guy's nuts. And she laughs. That highlights for us the unlikelihood that this would ever come to pass, and how it's so unreasonable that this would happen. Highlights for us the ability of God, the lesson is just what God says. Is anything too hard for the Lord? It's going to happen. If God means for it to happen, it's going to come to pass. And this phrase, too hard for the Lord, I think it's not a bad translation, because we do mean that, like nothing's too difficult for the Lord, but it's a word that is used elsewhere in different ways, and I think it's better translated in different ways. So your footnotes might have too wonderful for the Lord. In Isaiah 9, when it says he'll be called a wonderful counselor, this is what we're talking about. It's the same word. Like it's this amazing, incredible, remarkable thing. Is anything too amazing, too remarkable, too unlikely, too impossible, too hard, too mysterious for God to accomplish? No, not at all. Not at all. And Sarah says, no, I didn't laugh. I didn't doubt that would happen. I didn't doubt. I didn't laugh about that. God says, no, you did. You did. And I'm so thankful it's right there. She did laugh. Even Abraham and Sarah, both of them, Abraham fell on his face laughing and then argued with God about it once he realized what it would mean. Sarah laughed at this. This cannot ever happen. Who is this guy saying these things? It was the Lord. And it did happen. And that's so encouraging. Like, God's not just going to probably do the things that you think He can probably do. Those things, when you hear about them, that are laughable, you think that could never happen. Like, that's not too hard. God can do that. And He does do that. It's right here. That's wonderful. Don't set your sights low when you pray to God, when you see something in the Word, you think, it seems like God is promising me this. Don't say, well, it's probably not. That's less likely. Like, nothing's too hard. Nothing's too amazing, too remarkable. Nothing is this way for the Lord. I remember, as an example, very clear example from our own family. I can remember we had 3 miscarriages in a row. Jonas thought he was responsible for one of them. Right? I don't know if you'd remember that now, but it was a traumatic thing for him. And, we're talking about it, and I'm encouraging him just in prayer and things, and he's like, so what do you want to pray for? I want to pray for, I don't know if he said, what was it? Just for brothers, right? He said, I want to pray for brothers. And we just had Celine at the time. I'm like, well, I don't know, bud. Like, I'm thinking, we'll be lucky to get one kid, we get anybody. So he's praying, and then that turned into not just brothers, but also just, I want brothers or sisters. I'm talking to him. Like, basically, I kind of talk him down out of brothers, like brothers or sisters or whatever. Like, and I talk him down even further from that. Like, how about we just pray for, a brother or a sister. And we're praying this way, but then he would still slip into this. So like when we're praying, he would just pray sometimes for, he would say I want, he would say siblings. I was like, so then we get pregnant again. And we have twins. And it was like, what? Like, we get pregnant, and we don't tell Jonas because we're afraid this wasn't going to work out maybe, and I don't want to let him down. And so we go, and we think we're having a miscarriage, and we find out it's healthy twins. And it's like, what in the world? Like, God did more than we thought, right? And then what happens years later? He's got brothers. Like, he actually has brothers. Like, none of this was, right? So these are things, this is what we mean. Like, we were laughing at this. Well, God's doing this. And I remember even telling Angela, this is what he prayed. And we're just kind of laughing, like, kids, well, maybe the Lord will do it, but just let's, I don't want to, we're trying to encourage him in the Lord. And if he's praying these big things, and if the Lord doesn't do it, will he understand that? We can understand how that works. Maybe he won't. Well, he didn't have to. God just did it. Right? So here we are. It's this way. And it's so helpful. I would venture to say it's more encouraging to you to hear that story knowing that we were laughing about it and thinking this won't happen than if we just said, and so we just started believing God for these things, or we didn't really know what to think, but this is what the Lord did. It's more encouraging to think we were doubting. We thought this would never happen. It couldn't happen. And it's more encouraging to know. I mean, don't just look at this and think, oh, Sarah, she was doubting God. Think, it seemed impossible, and God just did it. Like, it was a natural reaction, which is what the narrator's telling you. He doesn't just say, an old ungodly Sarah laughed to herself. He says, now look, the way things were, don't forget, they were old. And there was no reason for her to think this would happen. And so, verse 12, so, it says, Sarah laughed to herself, because this is the way things were. Nobody ever thought that she was going to have a child, but she did. The only one who thought she would was God, because he said, I'm going to do it. And he brought it to pass. But what's the tendency? Sarah denied it, saying, I didn't laugh. God says, no, but you did laugh. God doesn't want us to forget the times that we doubted him. Like, he doesn't want us to doubt him, but don't forget those times that you were doubting him, because what's going to happen? 10 years down the road, maybe next week, sometime, something's going to happen, and you're going to be tempted to doubt God again. And he wants you to be able to look back and say, remember when you were laughing about this thing that I was going to do? I meant to do that thing. You thought it would never come to pass, and it happened. So trust me now, right? It's the same thing. God is meaning to build her faith. He doesn't want her to forget. You were laughing about this. Don't forget. You never thought it would be as good as it's going to be for you. But it's going to be. So that's application enough. Let me just say a couple other things on this same point. Maybe push it a little further. There's a real tendency among people, but even Christians, and it's sad that it's this way among Christians too, maybe to cover up your failures, right? Like, there's no purpose served in broadcasting our sins, right? But that's something different than what I mean. So, if we're going to talk about something God has done for us, we don't help other people by just telling all about, oh, look what God did for me, unless we give it the proper context. And a lot of times that involves some failures and some unbelief on our part. And it's not always comfortable to tell those things, but if you're really going to help people, if you're going to tell them what really happened, like, you need to include those things. And I'll just give another example, again, from our family on this, and I won't go into the specific details. Some of you know these things, and others it just wouldn't be appropriate because it's being recorded and all kinds of people could hear it. But there was a time when things were like, we hear all the time from people, they say, oh, I think it's just wonderful what you guys did. That's just so wonderful. We just respect you guys so much. You guys are just wonderful people, blah, blah, blah. It's like, whoa. We just stop them all the time and say, listen, you don't understand. The adoption part was easy. It was the foster care and the transition into maybe, are we going to adopt these boys, or what are we going to do? That was so hard, and things got to a point, and there was a season where we didn't think we could do it, and we were done, and we were ready to walk away. We tried to get out of foster care because of the particulars of the situation. It just was too hard, and we couldn't do it. We weren't able to go on. And then, to our surprise, some friends of ours came over and convinced us to give it another day. And we gave it another day, and that turned into 2 days, turned into a week, turned into something wonderful. But God did that. And the idea that we're just great people who just saw this thing through, that wasn't it at all. We were done. And God changed the whole thing and made it good. And that's helpful to know. If I look at it, that's the thing that I want you to take away if you're thinking about what we're doing. Not that, look at Chad and Angela and they adopted these boys. That isn't even a big deal. The big thing is, look what God did for us, right? And that's the thing that's going to maybe help you. And we could look at each other in the same way, right? Different ones of us involved in different things, doing different things. Different people in our lives, we could, as believers, look at one another and just say, I just think what you're doing is amazing with this thing or that thing or whatever. But the reality is, and you know it, the very same thing that people often look at you and think and commend you for, you look at it and you think, you have no idea. The Lord has helped me so much in this and upheld me. And that's what we need to be doing. We need to be forthright with people about those kinds of things. And we can be so helpful it's that way here. Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. But he said, no, but you did laugh. And here it is recorded for us. You know, think about the disciples in the Gospels. You know, I mean, those guys were not just bumbling idiots, but they were also that, right? They weren't just bumbling idiots, but they were that. Just like you or I. And I'm so thankful, right, for all of the mishaps and the miscues and the arguing and the infighting that they have about who's greatest and who's this and who's that. I'm glad it's there. That's an encouragement. I don't just look at those guys and think, look at that. You know, we don't want to be like Peter. Well, I mean, you got to be pretty bold to say, like, oh, even Peter denied him. He's awful. I wouldn't have, right? I mean, then you sound like Peter, right? Peter forsook the Lord. We do the same. I hear people all the time say this with, Adam and Eve. Well, if I was in the garden, I wouldn't have done that. And all this stuff could have been avoided. Like, who are you kidding? Right? It's not that way. Just be honest about our failures. And we'll find that oftentimes, especially with believers, when we're honest, when we're having real heart-to-heart conversations with people and we're honest about our sins and the way God has upheld us and forgiven us and carried us through, like that's the thing that helps other believers and encourages other believers. Not with just how perfectly you performed or how wonderfully it went. That's not what the help is. They might rejoice with you, but they're not going to get really food for their soul. I think of the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. You maybe just turn there and we'll close with this. 2 Corinthians 1. It really fits with just what I'm trying to say here. For we do not want you to be ignorant, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. What kind of affliction? What's he talking about? Well, he doesn't describe it in much detail, but he characterizes it this way. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Right? You don't need to know the details, specifically every little thing that happened. I don't need to write a book for you, a narrative account, but I can tell you this. I despaired even of life itself. I just wanted to die. This is what Paul says, right? What else does he mean? I despaired of life itself. We were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself, which means something like they wake up in the morning or they wake up from their 2 minutes of rest that they got on their sleepless night, and they think about what's in store for them for the rest of the day, and they just want to die. They would rather just die than go through another minute of what they're going through. We were so utterly burned beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. Right? Surely this is going to end in our death. There's no way out of this. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and He will deliver us. On Him we have set our hope that He will deliver us again. You also must help us by prayer so that many will give thanks on our behalf for the blessing granted us through the prayers of many. Right? So, here he is, and he's saying, I was at this point. I was done. And God delivered me. And I think the reason God brought me that low is so that I would just cast myself on Him totally. I thought I had done that. I'm the Apostle Paul, right? I've thought I've been cast on God completely all along. But there was a new level of it that happened there when I was going through this. And He delivered me. And not only did He deliver me, but I've set my hope on Him that He always can and that He will. And in fact, every Christian has, right? He's going to raise the dead. And that's my hope. And then he goes on to write the rest of his letter. So, again, we can be thankful the Scripture records these sorts of things for us. Why is this recorded here in Genesis? Well, again, it's to help us understand God's dealings with Abraham. God has chosen, as we're going to read here, we'll talk about next time, and we've talked about some in the past, but these next couple of verses in chapter 18, God has chosen Abraham, right, to teach his children and this nation a way of righteousness, to understand justice, the fear of God, to know what that looks like, and this is part of it. And it's very helpful for us to see God take this old man and this old woman and build them in the faith, strengthen them again and again through all the little things that they go through. I hope that, contrary to popular opinion, you no longer think that Sarah's laughter is met with judgment and Abraham is let off the hook, but rather almost the opposite. It's like Abraham's laughter turns into objecting before God, and God refuses him, and Abraham has to repent and accept what God said. Sarah didn't seem like know who she was laughing at, and once she did, lied about it, which was wrong, but just tried to cover the thing up because she didn't want to offend the Lord, that she had doubted him. And but the fact that she had doubted him is actually the thing God wanted her to remember. So she would, again, her faith would grow. Well, are there any questions or comments on these first 15 verses in Genesis 18?